Okay, so this one's a little bit different, bit of an education video, so to speak. I want to talk about British battlefields. That is battlefields across the United Kingdom. I'm not talking about battlefields in which the British Army or its predecessor formations, for want of a better term, has been involved. So, for example, Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Waterloo and the various commemorative sites around there, which, in the case of the two world wars and subsequent conflicts, are maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So that's not what I'm focusing on for this video. I'm focusing on battle sites within the British Isles, well, within Great Britain particularly, um, because it's interesting to see what's remembered and what isn't. Clearly, there is a lot of ways to look at what constitutes a battle. So, if we look at the history of warfare, and again, trying to be specific to the UK, we have had some very, very bloody engagements, and we've also had, within sometimes even within the same conflict, some engagements that are barely more than a skirmish, sometimes without even a single death. So that's interesting to see what is commemorated and what isn't. Now, there is actually a Wikipedia article on this, and it's entitled Registered Battlefields UK in brackets. And it states that both England and Scotland have a formal way of looking at registered battlefields, which is a relatively recent concept. Neither Wales or Northern Ireland has any sort of specific way of doing this, at least not yet. So the article says legislation to protect historic battlefields is relatively recent and arose following several key incidents involving important sites, such as the discovery in 1997 of an unprotected mass grave of soldiers who fought at the Battle of Towton in 1461, and a large metal detector rally held on the battlefield of Marston Moor in 2003. So, as it stands, there is sort of inventory or a registry. Well, in the case of England, it's called the Register of Historic Battlefields, and it lists 43 sites of the most important military battles on English soil, and it's maintained by English Heritage. Historic Scotland, which is a sort of sister organisation in Scotland, is responsible for the inventory of historic battlefields, and that lists 17 battlefields on the inventory. Now, by no means does this mean that there have only been 43 battles on English soil and only 17 battles on Scottish soil. In fact, if we look at Scotland, for example, there are probably dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of clan battles throughout the centuries. The better known ones are sort of remembered through folk narratives, but most of them are not listed in this inventory. And likewise with England, there are many, many engagements in English history that are not registered. This is not necessarily that they're just being ignored. In some cases, it's that there is limited information available. So, for example, if we look at some of the battles from before the Norman conquest in the so-called Dark Ages, I prefer to give the term the Heptarchy, the period of the Seven Kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Some of those battles aren't registered, not because they weren't important, but because there is a lack of information about them. So, for example, the Battle of Meriton in the year 871. This was an engagement between King Ethelred and Alfred the Etheling on one side versus Halfdan Ragnarsson on the other. So it was basically Saxons versus Vikings. The Wikipedia article states it was between the Saxon army of Wessex and the Danish Great Heathen army, and we know it took place on the 22nd of March 871. That will be in the old calendar. But here's the problem: we don't know the exact location. Was it Dorset? Was it Hampshire? Was it Wiltshire? And we know it was a Viking victory. The fact is, without knowing the exact location, you can't have any sort of commemorative site. A number of locations have been named. The village of Marten with Marten, that's the spelling in Wiltshire. Wimborne Minster in Dorset is a possibility because that's where Ethelred died. Also in Wiltshire, there's another village called Marden. Murden Castle in Hampshire. So, that becomes problematic, actually establishing where some of these locations are, particularly with Viking and Anglo-Saxon battle sites. I actually have a book. I've had this book for years, almost 20 years. It's called British Battles. It's by English Heritage, although it includes Scottish battles as well, by Ken and Denise Guest, and it features photographs of reenactment societies. It features well-known battles like Hastings and Towton and Marston Moor, also some lesser well-known battles, which I'm pleased that they've also included. But I used to assume that the battles they feature in this were the extent of battles on British soil, which of course is not the case. Bosworth is featured here, the Battle of Flodden in 1513, which was actually the last battle in which a British monarch died in battle. Some people assume it was Bosworth where Richard III was killed, but actually at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, decades later, King James III, I believe it was, became the last British king, either English or Scottish, to die in battle. I'll just double check that. I think it was James III. I should know this, but going off the top of my head. This was in forces actually organised by Queen Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII was otherwise engaged. Um, yeah, King James IV, excuse me, not James III, James IV. James III had also died in battle in 1488, but James IV of Scotland became the last British monarch to die in battle at Flodden in 1513. This was a major battle, and it was near Branksome in Northumberland, and casualties are up to 17,000 on the Scottish side, 1,500 on the English side. So it was a bloodbath. Um, the bloodiest battle on English soil actually goes to Towton in 1461. It was so deadly that it has been called the Somme of the Middle Ages. High figures suggest as many as 28,000 Englishmen fell at the Battle of Towton. It was on a snowy day in March 1461. I mean, to put that in context, if you work out the casualties for all the battles of the Wars of the Roses, I've done this, I've done some research into this. It worked out at about 60,000. So if we assume, let's say even go for a lower figure of 25,000, that means almost half of all those who died in the Wars of the Roses died on this one day on a snowy field in what is now West Yorkshire, just west of present day Leeds. Um, so clearly a very major engagement took place there. But just looking at these registers, with some well-known battles, there are pre-existing monuments that often went up in centuries later, like the 18th century. I know there's a monument at Flodden. There is also a monument, I believe, at Northallerton, which is also known as the Battle of the Standard, which took place in 1138. But the registered battlefield, just to name some of the battle sites that are listed in the English historic battlefields that are listed, this includes the Battle of Barnet in 1471, the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, the Battle of Culloden Hill in 1333, the Battle of Hastings, of course, in 1066, Battle of Homildon Hill in 1402. Culloden Hill, Homildon Hill, not to be confused, different battles. Culloden Hill was 1333, Homildon Hill 1402. The Battle of Northampton 1460, the Battle of Naseby 1645, the Battle of Lewes, that was during the Second Barons' Revolt in 1264. The Battle of Towton, of course, in 1461. The Battle of Stow on the Wold, 1646, the Battle of Stokefield, 1487, the Battle of Sedgemoor, which has some claims to being the last battle on English soil, in 1685, the Battle of Solway Moss in 1542, which I believe is in Cumbria. Um, That incidentally, that claim of last battle on English soil is contentious. It was certainly the last significant battle on English soil, but there was a skirmish outside Preston during the 1715 Jacobite Rising. If we look at, there was also the so-called Battle of Bosenden Wood in Kent in 1833, I believe, but that was more an industrial skirmish rather than a full-scale pitched battle between armies. So defining a battle is also very important. Scottish historic battlefields include the Battle of Pinkie, 1547, which was known as Black Saturday in Scotland during the Rough Wooing, the Battle of Prestonpans, 1745, the Battle of Culloden, of course, significant as the last pitched battle on British soil in 1746, the Battle of Kilsyth, 1645, the Battle of Bannockburn during the Scottish Wars of Independence in 1314. Um, the Battle of Harlaw is one of the few clan battles that's included in 1411, but there's many, many others that are certainly not included in the list of Scottish battles. The Battle of Killiecrankie, 1689. I mean, that was 17 battles on Scottish soil. Believe me, Scotland has had a lot more than 17 battles. But like I say, very often it's about defining what constitutes a battle. Sometimes it's a lack of information. Sometimes it's disputes over exactly where a battle took place. Another example being the Battle of Asenden in 1016. Again, there's some debate over exactly where that battle took place. Um, so, for example, there's various locations named. Essex has been named. Hampshire has been named. Numerous locations have been named. One of the most significant battles, actually, of the Saxon era was the also considered to be the most important battle on English soil prior to the Battle of Hastings, and that is the Battle of Brunanburh. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. There is a lot of debate over exactly where this took place, but it was fought in the year 937 between Aethelstan, King of England, and an alliance of Olaf Guthricsson, or Guthfrithson, King of Dublin, Constantine II, King of Scotland, and Owen, King of Strathclyde. The battle is often cited as the point of origin for English nationalism. It's an extremely important battle because this marked sort of um, time of English unification. We know there were heavy losses, and the only information that's available regarding location is it took place somewhere in England. Um, so sources have been named as wide range of sources. Brumborough on the Wirral, Barnsdale Bar north of Doncaster, um, and many other locations. It seems that the Wirral might be the strongest possible location, but there is a huge amount of debate. Beverley, north of Hull, has been named. Um, so that's the difficulty with particularly Saxon battlefield. There is a lot of differing information. Um, if you look at some of the major conflicts like the Wars of the Three Kingdoms or the Norman Conquest or the Wars of the Roses or the Scottish Wars of Independence, you'll find a lot of smaller scale skirmishes that are not included. And another thing that is not included is sieges. So historic cities like Edinburgh and York have had many sieges throughout their history, but they're not included. Um, because where would you mark it? Would you mark it on the castle? Would you mark it on the high street? So a siege is not classed as a battle in the same way, although it is a form of warfare. So anyway, I'll just show you a quick look at the book that I've got. It's a very interesting book. It shows all sorts of information about weaponry. It features photographs by organisations like the Steel Knot Society. Really good photography in this book. This is Titan. Um, it shows just the different style of warfare. This is the Battle of Chalgrove during the English Civil War, which of course was part of the larger conflict, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. But anyway, it's fascinating stuff for anyone who's interested in history. But the total number of battles listed in that inventory, so 43 in England, 17 in Scotland, is 60. If you do a bit of research on British history, as I have done, I have counted literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of engagement. Some of them are skirmishes with no more than a dozen killed. Some of them are very large scale battles. As for the largest battles on British soil, during the Budokan revolts, there was a battle known as, which later became known as the Battle of Watling Street. It wasn't called that at the time, but it was basically the confederation of British tribes led by Boudica, um, and she was heading other tribes versus the Romans. Now, Roman sources suggest that there were 80,000 British casualties to just 400 Roman casualties. Probably an exaggeration. Nevertheless, it is conceivable that it was a very bloody engagement. That could be anywhere from Northamptonshire to London. London Bridge in the Middle Ages was known as Battle Bridge, so it's possible it took place in London, but more likely it took place somewhere in the Midlands, because the old Watling Street was the old Roman road. If we take that Roman source, then that by far is the bloodiest battle on British soil. But allowing that to be an exaggeration, Towton is almost certainly the bloodiest battle on English soil. That is England as a unified state with up to 28,000 casualties. Flodden ranks among the bloodiest, 1513, at least at least 15,000 dead, cumulatively speaking. Bannockburn was a very deadly engagement. Um, Hastings isn't just famous, it was a particularly deadly battle with between 6 and 8,000 casualties. And in those days, being that there was no modern medicine, many of the combatants would have died from the disease. And needless to say, medieval warfare was brutal. It's difficult to imagine what those men went through. Um, the savagery of medieval battle. Braveheart got a lot of things wrong, but it got that accurate, the savagery of it. Um, I personally think it was the religious fervor that these men thought, okay, I could have an axe, smashed into my skull, but I'm going to have eternal paradise. I think it must have been an extreme religious fervor, a sort of extreme religious dogma that must have kept some sort of sanity. Otherwise, I don't know how they could have done it. It's quite a thought. Other battles on English soil, Stoke Field. Sometimes Bosworth is considered the end of the Wars of the Roses, and certainly it was very significant because it involved the death of Richard III. But actually, 2 years later, the Battle of Stoke Field in Nottinghamshire was technically the last major battle of the Wars of the Roses, and it was a very deadly engagement, up to 7,000 dead. Um, what else, just off the top of my head? Both Halidon Hill and Homildon Hill were major engagements. Pretty much every county in England has seen at least one or two battles, some more so than others. My area, up here in the northeast, particularly Northumberland, I think Northumberland has seen more than its fair share because of its location, because it is the border county and the Scottish borders as well. Uh, Probably Northumberland has more battlefields than any other English county, unless I'm mistaken. Um, but like I say, with a lot of Saxon battles, finding the precise location is difficult. And very often the information is lacking as well. For example, details about casualties and so on. There was one battle, for example, the Battle of Crayford or Creckenford, which took place in the year 457, most likely at what is now Crayford in the London borough of Bexley, I believe, Crayford, Kent. There's very little information with that except that 4,000 men were slain. So we assume there were 4,000 casualties. Um, if we compare Britain to other European countries, I don't think we've got the bloodiest of histories compared to France, for example. However, we've had our fair share of conflicts. I'm talking in cumulative fatality terms. I mean, as an example, the French Wars of Religion, up to 3 million dead. Nothing in Britain comes close to that. But we've had our fair share of, internal bloody conflicts. So I do think it would be good to see more of these battlefields being recognised. Obviously, it would need the weight of historical evidence. It would need particular significance. We should remember that we enjoy relative political peace today. Britain, like most countries, is, our democracy, our freedom was really through centuries of bloodshed. And we should never forget that. And we should never forget the sacrifice of the ordinary men who, who really, the bravery that they must have faced on all sides. Sobering, really. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you live near any of these battlefields, what some of the better known ones or even some of the lesser known ones. Um, I mean, there's some in Scotland that were very, very deadly, but seem to be sort of overlooked. Certain battles, for example, Culloden and Bosworth, are particularly famous because of their political significance. That doesn't necessarily mean they were the deadliest. So that's interesting. Let me know if you live near any of these places, and yeah, just if you've any points to add. So, British battlefields, interesting subject.